So I'm so happy to be here talking about a little bit about my experience, a little bit about the Bible. We're going to go through a lot of stuff today. It may feel a little bit like drinking out of a fire hose, which is why we have these cards on your table. So if you've got cards on your table, you can write down questions anytime, and then we'll pick them up at the end. I'll do my best to answer them. I always say regarding questions that because I'm putting myself in a position where I am out here for you to ask questions of, I'm fine answering any question that doesn't include what's underneath your clothes. Don't ask me about my body, because that's private, and I wouldn't ask you about yours. But outside of that, I'm down to answer any questions that you have. So feel free to write those on your cards. The other thing that I'd like to say is we've got seats in and amongst the table. So folks that are at the back and are standing, if you want to move up, get to know your neighbors, come hang out. It's going to be a nice time. I'm sure the people at the tables are lovely. So let me tell you a little bit about my experience. This is a picture of me at about age 10. And I grew up in a couple of different things you have to know about me growing up. Number one, I grew up in an evangelical context, evangelical non-denominational church until I was about 10. And in that context, people were not especially thrilled about anyone who had a different gender identity or sexuality. It was generally frowned upon to not be a straight cisgender person. And we'll talk about what cisgender means in a minute here. But my background in only hearing bad things about lesbian and gay and bisexual people, that was sort of my first introduction to what Christian community looked like. I understood Christian to be synonymous with not affirming of LGBT people, right? That was the only context that I had. The second thing that you should know about me and growing up is that I was assigned female at birth, which means that when I was born, the doctors took one look at one very small part of me and went, "It's a girl." And then I got to wait 25 years to say, "Actually, no, you're wrong." And you don't get to correct doctors that often, so it was exciting. For me, being assigned female at birth and growing up in a way that everybody would look at me and think, "That's a girl." I looked like I was the oldest of 3 girls. I have 2 younger siblings, 2 younger sisters. It was confusing to me as somebody who didn't feel like a girl. I didn't feel like a girl growing up. I didn't really know what I felt like because, honestly, when we think about it, how do we know what anybody else's experience of gender is in order to compare to ours, right? We have a lot of social ideas about what men are like and what women are like, but it's really hard to compare internal experiences. It's hard to say, I feel like a guy the way that the person next to me feels like a guy. That's a hard thing to try to figure out. So as a kid, I wasn't really sure about anything about my gender, but I knew that I didn't feel like a girl. So this picture is probably this is a picture that I look back on and go, yes, that's me. That's the essence of me at 10 years old. And I kind of just look like everybody in my family called me a tomboy, right? My mom was kind of a tomboy when she was growing up, so was my mom's mom, so kind of everybody was like, this is normal. And I didn't have any context for understanding anything outside of, identifying with the sex that you were assigned. I didn't know that there was any other way to be in the world. So this is me when I was younger, right? Growing up in that context, I came out as a teenager at about 15. I came out as bisexual. And this was just basically a reaction to me going, yes, I've fallen in love with my best friend who is a girl. And then a couple years later being yes, I've fallen in love with my best friend who's a boy. And wait a minute, what's going on here, right? My sort of normal teenage growing up and having crushes on people, it just made it very clear that I was attracted to people of all different genders, and that wasn't really a thing for me. But I held that knowledge at the same time that I held the knowledge that my faith community would not be thrilled about this, right? This was not something that they were going to be affirming of. So I kind of took in this idea that something about me was bad and wrong because I had these feelings for other people, right? Because I was attracted to people of different genders. That was not it was something that I had to sort of unlearn after I came out. And I wasn't aware that there was a church out there that would accept me for a really long time. So when I was about 12, my family moved to a different church, and still not a very affirming one. And I kind of, as teenagers tend to do, I sort of kicked against everything and was like, I don't want to be part of this church anymore. I don't want to be part of a church that doesn't love me for who I am, inclusive of my sexuality, right? But there was a church down the road that a friend of mine went to that was more LGBT affirming. I should say, they didn't say anything negative about LGBT people, which was like a low bar, but it was like a big jump up for me, right? Like, at least they don't say anything bad. And I started following her to church, and that was the first time that I was like, whoa, there could be a church that loves people for who they are without constantly saying, there's something wrong with you, right? There's something wrong with you that needs to be fixed. So this is me in high school. Prior to finding out that it was possible to be a Christian and be LGBT affirming, I was pretty sure I didn't want anything to do with Christianity. I'm pretty sure that it wasn't really for me. But I found community in the LGBT group that I helped form at school, so at least I had something to go on, right? So imagine me at the end of high school, right, and kind of into college. I kind of feel like I've got my sexuality figured out. I'm feeling a little better about religion. I found an affirming church. I'm feeling a little bit about where my faith is. And that's kind of where I was. This is me, middle of college. I decided to get baptized. I finally said, you know what, this is it. Because I'd been raised in a non-denom church that didn't do infant baptism, right? So we did immersion baptism in that church later on as an adult. And now I was in a Lutheran tradition where we did the sprinkling, right? I love that you all have both. Like, you all have the one and the other, right? As an adult in the Lutheran church, I finally came to a point where I thought, like, okay, I'm ready to do this. I'm ready to be baptized. I'm ready to be part of this church community, this new affirming church community that I had found. But even that, like, even having figured out the sexuality part, even having figured out the faith part, kind of, as much as anyone ever does, I still felt like there was something that I hadn't figured out, and that was sort of like in the back of my mind, just sort of this box in a corner that I was trying to pretend it wasn't there, right? And this box became more prevalent for me because right after college, I took about a year off to save some money, and then I went to seminary. I went to seminary because I thought, surely the people in seminary will have all the answers about faith and religion, and I can learn from them. But as anybody who's actually been to seminary in this room knows, they don't have all the answers. That's not what seminary education is for. Seminary education teaches you how to ask better questions, teaches you how to be in community with people, right? While I was in seminary, it became clear that this box that I was sort of trying to not pay attention to was like I was going to have to look at it. I was going to have to address it. Because I was learning more every day about how to be in authentic community with people and how to be in authentic relationship with my neighbors and with God. It's really hard to be in relationship to somebody or with God when you're like hiding this little part of yourself that you're like, please don't look at this part. This part is bad. This part I don't understand. It's hard to be open with other people when you've got all these walls up around this one thing that you're trying to hide. So for me, it came to a point where I was like, you know what? I got to think about my gender. So I started thinking about like, what was my experience of gender? I started reading a lot. Dangerous, I know, to read too much. But I started understanding more about my gender and realizing that I identified as male and that I had pretty much my entire life. And how was I going to make this make sense? Like, I'd already come out in church once. I didn't want to have to do this whole thing again, right? So this was a difficult thing for me, but I got through it with the help of a lot of my sort of fellow students in seminary. I started sort of coming out to them one by one, and they were really helpful in helping me understand my faith and my gender together. And I started diving into scripture because as somebody who grew up in a conservative evangelical church, the most important thing to me was the Bible, right? The most important thing to me was, what does God say about this in the Bible? And so I thought, I have to learn more about this. So I graduated from seminary in 2014, and I did not come out as transgender prior to graduating from seminary because I wasn't totally sure they'd let me graduate. I graduated from Luther Seminary in the Twin Cities in Minnesota Luther Seminary is the largest evangelical Lutheran seminary in the U.S., but it's also the only one that isn't officially LGBT affirming. So technically, they could have been like, nah, you've done the schoolwork, you've passed all your tests, but you can't graduate because you're trans, and we don't pass people that are trans. So I waited. This is me on graduation day. Imagine me graduating like that, and people being like, ah, yes, that's a girl. Yep. No, of course not. At this point, most people knew that I was trans. I was presenting in a more masculine way. But I wasn't officially out until right after I graduated. So they handed me my diploma, and I was like, surprise. Everybody took it really well. It was fine. I wasn't ready to be the first trans graduate from Luther. However, my friend Asher, who graduated the very next year, was, and he was great. He had some foibles and fumbles, but in general, everything went fine. So proud to say that Luther has now graduated 2 other trans folks who are now pastoring. So, yeah, that's worth applause, I think. So having said all that about my story, I want to talk a little bit about gender. I kind of made that distinction between sexuality and gender earlier, right? Sexuality is who you are attracted to. It is about your relationship sort of romantically, affectionately towards other people. Your gender is something that is just about you and your own sort of identity. Like, you could raise somebody without connection to any other people and they would still have a sense of gender. It would be a little bit weird because part of the way we understand our gender is by looking at other people and responding to them, but you would still have a gender. There are lots of different frameworks for understanding gender, and the frameworks are moving and changing as we understand more about what gender is and how it works. So here's the metaphor that I'll give you. Back 500, 800 years ago, we didn't have another way to look at the night sky other than with the naked eye, right? We maybe had some very basic telescopes, but mostly we were just looking at the sky with our eyes. And we could see the moon, and we could see some stars, we could maybe see some planets, right? We could see some shooting stars. That's about all we could see. At this point, we have super mega high-powered telescopes, and we can look out into the universe and see things we have no way to understand yet. We can see black holes, and we can see supernovas. We can see all these things that were beyond our initial understanding of. The only things that exist are stars and planets and moons, right? That was our original idea. Gender is kind of the same way. We are understanding more every day about how gender works, how it's constructed, how we all get our gender and how our brains work. And as we learn more, these sort of, the ways that we understand our gender changes. So it's not so much that gender itself is changing, it's that we're learning more every day and we're kind of expanding our knowledge base. So the way that I'm going to explain gender today is by saying that your gender in general is made up of sort of 3 different parts. The first part is your body. And that includes everything from your brain to your internal and external reproductive organs, to your hormone levels, to your genetics. That's all part of your body, right? The second part is your identity. Your identity is your sense of being male or female or both or neither one of those things. And then the third part is your gender expression, which is how you show that internal identity to the world by how you dress and how you do your hair and how you walk and how you talk. Those are all your gender expression. Now, having split gender into these 3 parts, it's also important to notice that they are all interconnected, right? Like, your identity is framed in your brain, which is part of your body, right? So these things are not, like, easily taken apart. They're all interconnected. The other way that you might have heard your body referred to is the way that I referred to it earlier when I said I was assigned female at birth. The body part of this equation has also been called assigned sex. So people will talk about the difference between your assigned sex and your identity, your gender identity. Everybody has an assigned sex, and most of the people in the world are assigned either male or female when they're born based on their external reproductive organs. But because, like I said, our bodies are made up of more than just our external reproductive organs, there is more to assigned sex even than we had originally thought. About 1.7% of the population of the United States is something called intersex. To be intersex means to have some of these factors, your reproductive organs, your genetics, your hormone levels, they don't all line up along just male or just female lines. There are people who have differences in these sex characteristics, and that 1.7%, you would think that that's actually a pretty small percentage, right? But 1.7% is about the same percentage of people who have naturally red hair. So if you think about like walking down the street and the number of people that you see that you think have naturally red hair, like that's actually kind of a large percentage when you think about looking over a crowd of people, right? A lot of intersex people don't know that they're intersex because a lot of times we have DNA differences that we don't know about because more people are getting their DNA tested today than ever before, but still, it's not common for people to have their sex chromosomes sort of linked and tested. It's actually more common than we think to have, we think of DNA usually as male being XY and female being XX, right? But there's actually common patterns where it's like XYY and XXX and XYY. We have different patterns going on, but because our genetic code isn't always sort of turned on, it's turned on by proteins and hormones, you may have different genetics, not know it, and never have those genetics sort of turned on. So it's actually more common to be intersex than we think. So, all of this to say, gender and our bodies and assigned sex, it's all very complicated, right? It's more common than we think to have a gender identity that is different from our assigned sex. I say all of this to give you a background on how we understand assigned sex and gender today, because it's important to know for the people that you're going to be interacting with today. But when we look back at the Bible, when we look back at ancient texts, it's very important to remember that these concepts didn't exist then, right? We don't want to look back at people in the Bible and be like, aha, there's a transgender person, because the concept of being transgender didn't exist at that point. What we can look back at is we can look back at people who have who express their gender in ways that are unusual, in ways that don't seem to fit the masculine and feminine genders of the time, right? We can look back and we can see people who have experience of marginalization based on their relationships. So we can look back and see similar experiences, even if our understanding of these things is different now than it used to be. So, like I said, the Bible is something that is still very important to me, and it's sort of a touchstone that we can all kind of gather around and go, what's going on here? The first text that I want to talk about is from Genesis 1, and this is a foundational text, right? This is the creation of the world. This is the creation of the cosmos. And sometimes people look at this text and they will say, aha, Genesis says that there are only men and women. That's it. You can't be anything other than that, and you also can't change one in for the other. So this is the Genesis text here. I'm not going to read the whole thing for you, but this middle here that says, God created humankind in his image. In the image of God, he created them. Male and female, he created them, right? So we look at that and we go like, that seems pretty clear cut. That seems kind of cut and dried. That's what God created. But when we look at the whole of Genesis 1, the whole chapter, we see that it's written in this very poetic style, right? And you probably remember from maybe your Sunday school days that God creates the world in Genesis 1 by separating things into boxes, right? God, the Spirit of God is hovering over the face of the water, and God separates the waters above from the waters below. It's split into two, right? You get waters below and you get sky. Then God says, all right, we're going to separate the land from the sea. And God goes like this and puts them in two boxes. And then God says, we're going to separate the day from the night. And so those two things are split into two boxes. And the day gets the sun, and the night gets the moon, right? Everything is split into these two boxes all the way through. And we get this wonderful poetic language where every time God creates something, every time God does this action and something new is created, it says that God saw that it was good, right? There was evening, there was morning, the first, the second, the third day. God saw that it was good every time. It's this wonderful poetic meter. So it shouldn't surprise us that when we get to this last bit where God is creating humans at the end of Genesis 1, God would be like, okay, and now God creates humans, and here's the two boxes, right? It makes sense in the context of the way this chapter is written. However, we wouldn't look at the rest of Genesis and the rest of the things that are created and say or imply or believe that only the things in those boxes existed. For instance, we recognize that God creates day and separates it from the night and pulls it apart like this, right? But we acknowledge that in the world that we live in, there also exists dawn and dusk, the places in between. We recognize that God creates the land and separates it from the sea and pulls those things apart. But we recognize that estuaries and marshes and beaches and coral reefs exist. All these things in the middle, right? And they are no less beloved and no less good. God created them as well, right? The original writers of the Hebrew Bible, of the Old Testament, were not trying to say, here's a list of everything God made. They're saying, here is a format, here is a structure in which God created the cosmos, and everything exists within these constructs. So then it gets to the point where we talk about gender, at the end of Genesis 1. It's not in any way heretical to say, all right, God creates people male and female, but we also know that, for instance, intersex people exist, people who are born with natural differences. We recognize that there are middle spaces in gender and in assigned sex in the same way that there are middle spaces in pretty much every other category of things that God creates in Genesis 1. So maybe we can see this more as sort of endpoints on a spectrum than two discrete boxes. My friend M. Barclay, who's a deacon in the United Methodist Church, says that if we can understand God as the Alpha and the Omega, the beginning and the end, and recognize that that means encompassing from the beginning to the end, then it's also easy to understand God created them male and female as this encompassing movement, not as two discrete things. So let's talk a little bit more about Genesis here. But when we talk about being created in the image of God in Genesis, the only thing we know about God in Genesis 1 is that God creates stuff. God's a maker. God is a creator. That is all we have to go on. And so when humans are created in God's image, that means we are also created as creators. We are also created as makers, right? And that's affirmed again in the next chapter in Genesis 2, when God makes all the animals, and then God sort of passes them on to Adam and is like, all right, Adam, I made these animals, now you name them. God is bringing Adam into this creative process as a creative partner, right? So I was reading through the commentary in the New Interpreter's Bible at one point, and I came across this text where it says, the involvement in the creative process of those created in the divine image takes the form of a command. These first divine words to human beings are about their relationship not to God, but to the earth. They constitute a sharing of the exercise of power or dominion. From the beginning, God chooses not to be the only one who has or exercises creative power. The initiative has been solely God's, but once the invitation has been issued, God establishes a power-sharing relationship with humans. So this idea that humans are in relationship to God by also being creators, not at the same level or with the same amount of power by any means, but the idea that we are in a creative relationship together means that we do things to be good stewards of our world, right? It also means that we do things to be good stewards of our bodies and of our minds, of our mental health, of our physical health, for the health of our neighbors, right? These are ways that we are co-creators and co-workers in the world with God. And sometimes, for transgender people, that might mean transitioning, right? Transitioning is a word that we use to describe moving from one sort of gender as seen in the world to another kind of gender that people can see, right? We usually talk about two different kinds of transitioning, medical transition and social transition. Social transition includes things like changing your name, changing your pronouns, changing the way you dress maybe, right? Getting a haircut. Those are all changing your social, the way your gender is seen in the world in a social context. Medical transition may include things like having hormone therapy or having what we call gender-confirming surgery, right? Those are medical ways of helping you live in the most healthy way in your body, in a way that allows you to be fully alive and fully in relationship with other people. The next thing I want to talk about here is gender expression, right? Gender expression in the Bible. This is the other text. Genesis 1, and there are basically three texts that are used as sort of proof text against transgender people. Genesis 1 is the first one. This is the second one. This is Deuteronomy 22:5, which says, "A woman shall not wear a man's apparel, nor shall a man put on a woman's garment, for whoever does such things is abhorrent to the Lord your God." Again, we look at this and we go, that seems pretty cut and dried. I don't know what to do with that, right? To give us some context to this verse, we think that what was going on here is that the people of ancient Israel had neighbors of other religions who would use dressing in different gendered clothing as part of their religious rituals. And so this probably was a way of the people of Israel saying, we're not like that religion, we are like this religion, we worship the God of Israel, right? It was a way of like separating from religious practices from other places, from what we actually do, right? We think that's what's going on. The thing that complicates this rule or this law is that there are people in the Bible who do seem to dress outside of their assigned gender. So the other reason that we think this text may have come about is the ancient rabbis who were working on this text. Of course, Jewish folks have been doing work on these old texts far longer than Christians have, right? Jewish folks that have been reading these texts have for a long time said this verse might be about weapons of war and armor and not wanting women specifically to go into battle for a host of reasons, most of them about sexism, but this idea of like keeping women from putting on weapons of war, right? So let's go with that interpretation for a minute. This is about not wanting women to put on male garments, especially in the context of battle, right? So if we look at that, this is actually a quote from Abraham Ibn Ezra. Ibn Ezra is one of the main sort of scholars of these ancient texts in the Jewish tradition, right? He says, the passage dealing with the attire of a man is juxtaposed to the passages dealing with going to war because women were created to rear children, and if she were to instead go out among the men to war, she would eventually become involved in debauchery. I mean, it's just inevitable, right? You just fall right into it. For the same reason, a man might not dress himself in women's clothing, because otherwise a man who does not yet have a full beard could mix with women, and he could fornicate with them without the matter becoming widely known. So when you read this, you're like, this actually sounds a little bit like the arguments we have about bathrooms right now, and like trans people in bathrooms, right? This idea that a man could go into a woman's restroom, and that could be a real problem, right? So I want to take this apart a little bit in two pieces. The first one, let's talk about the private spaces and the bathroom thing. Recognizing that this is definitely a concern and we definitely want to have spaces that are safe, especially for women, right? We also need to recognize the reality of a situation in which trans women are actually at an astronomically high rate for violence in every space, whether they're on the street and whether they're in private spaces, wherever they are. And so recognizing the reality of a situation in which we definitely want safe women's spaces, but safe women's spaces have to include transgender women because they are the ones at the highest risk of violence. So recognizing the reality versus maybe some of our fears and how we hold those together. The second part of this text is about the weapons of war bit, right? And that's the part that I want to hold together with another Bible story. This other Bible story comes from the book of Judges. If you're familiar with Deborah, she was the only female judge of Egypt, right? Of Israel. She was amazing. Her story is amazing. We get this story of Deborah talking to her general, Barak, right? And Deborah and Barak are trying to decide how to liberate their people, and they decide that it's necessary to go to war. And so Barak says to Deborah, if you will go with me, I will go, but if you will not go with me, I will not go. And she says, I will surely go with you. Nevertheless, the road on which you are going will not lead to your glory, for the Lord will sell Sisera, this opposing general, into the hands of a woman. Then Deborah got up and went with Barak to Kadesh, and Barak summoned Zebulun and Naphtali to Kadesh, and 10,000 warriors went up behind him, and Deborah went up with him. Deborah went to the battlefield with him. This idea of keeping women out of battle does not seem to have stopped Deborah, regardless of what the Deuteronomy text says. And recognizing that Deborah is seen as a woman of valor, seen as a good leader, as somebody who did the right things, holding that in juxtaposition with that law, if it was about weapons of war, is an interesting, how do we do with that? What do we do with that? How do we complicate that text? So I'm going to skip here onto this bit about Joseph. Joseph is the other character who seems to have dressed in a way that was gender non-conforming. So let's toss away that weapons of war bit for a minute. What if we're just talking about everyday clothing? What if that Deuteronomy text just says, don't wear the clothing of another gender, period, right? When we look at Joseph, we seem to see somebody who does that, and we're not totally sure why. So let me give you this verse here. This is Genesis 37, verses 3 and 4. It says, Israel loved Joseph more than any other of his children, because he was a son of his old age, and he had made him a long robe with sleeves. But when his brothers saw that their father loved him more than all his brothers, they hated him and could not speak peaceably to him. So, this thing that Joseph gets, which we all know as the Technicolor dream coat, right? The coat of many colors, this thing that is the famous thing for Joseph, We don't totally know what this garment is. We've translated it a lot of different ways over the years. This is the NRSV text, and it translates it as a long robe with sleeves, but you might have heard of it as the coat of many colors, a coat with fringes, a coat with tassels. There's lots of ways to translate this text. We translate it so many different ways because we don't know what the Hebrew means. The Hebrew for this bit of garment is ketonet pasim. One of the ways we understand how to translate text from ancient languages is by looking for context, looking for other places where it shows up in the Bible, for instance, or even outside of the Bible in literature from the same time. When we look at ketonet pasim and go, is that anywhere else in the Bible? We only find it one other place in the entire Bible where it shows up, and that's in 2 Samuel 13:18 in the story of Tamar. And Tamar, her story is terrible, her story is awful, but we get a specific direction on what this thing is, this ketonet pasim is. 2 Samuel 13:18 says, "Now she was wearing a long robe with sleeves, a ketonet pasim, for this is how the virgin daughters of the king were clothed in earlier times." So when people look at this text and they go, aha, we are specifically told in 2 Samuel that this thing appears to be a princess dress, why is Joseph wearing a princess dress? What's going on, right? Jewish scholars, again, who have been doing this a lot longer than we have read Joseph as canonically gender-non-conforming, canonically queer for a lot of history. It hasn't quite gotten over into Christian spaces yet, but because a lot of the experiences that Joseph has are similar to the experiences of LGBT people today. For instance, being bullied by his brothers, nearly being murdered in what we would essentially consider a hate crime today, getting to Egypt, living in the house of Potiphar, who was an official there, and when Potiphar's wife kind of comes on to Joseph is so not into it, he literally runs out the door. There are a lot of things about Joseph that make us go, what's going on with him? And yet, he is one of the most celebrated people in the Old Testament. He is a person who, from the beginning of the story to the end of his story, is a positive model, which is actually really hard to find in the Bible. Usually it's people who are kind of screwing up and then getting forgiven. Abraham being a great example of that, right? But for Joseph, he has a great story the whole way through, despite having these sort of experiences and gender expressions that are not normal for his gender. So how do we hold these things together? How do we note that both things do exist in the text? The next topic I want to talk about here for a minute is renaming, right? I don't know about y'all, but I'm still sort of have a lot of evangelical Pentecostal friends that are still in those spaces. And when Caitlyn Jenner came out in 2015, it seemed like every megachurch pastor suddenly had to have an opinion about transgender people and name changes, right? There was suddenly this movement that you shouldn't call transgender people by their right names because, Christians shouldn't do that kind of thing for some reason. The thing that jumped out to me immediately was all the stories in the Bible of people who have had their names changed, right? People generally get a new name in the Bible for one of two reasons. Either they get a new name to recognize an identity that they already have that hasn't really been recognized or seen yet, or they get a new name to recognize a change in identity. So a new name to match that new identity that they have. So a couple people in the Bible that have new names, right? Of course, the original is Abram and Sarai. They get new names as a show of their new identity in their covenant with God. Abraham becomes the father of a multitude, the father of many nations, right? And that covenant extends to Sarah as well. So they get new names to match their new identity, right? Joshua, who you remember marched around the walls of Jericho, Joshua was another person who actually got a new name. Joshua was his new name. His old name was Hoshea. He was given the name Joshua when he became Moses' second in command. So along with that new identity as Moses' second in command, he gets a new name. An interesting one to look at is in the book of Ruth, we hear about Naomi. Naomi is Ruth's mother-in-law, right? And at the beginning of the book of Ruth, everything has gone wrong for Naomi. Literally everything that could go wrong has gone wrong. She is in a terrible place. She has no living blood relatives, right? All she has are her daughters-in-law. And at the beginning of the book of Ruth, she says, "No longer call me Naomi, but call me Mara." Mara means bitter. Somebody who the Hebrew is connected to that sort of puckering face that you make when something is really bitter, you can't let go of this sort of clenched feeling. That's what she says, call me Mara, right? Throughout the book of Ruth, nobody calls her Mara, not once. And we kind of can't totally figure out why people don't go with that until the end of the story, when it turns out that Naomi has actually been blessed through her daughter-in-law Ruth, right? Eventually she has a grandson. Eventually she has the family that she's always wanted. Eventually she is back on solid socioeconomic footing, and the things that would have made her bitter are no longer there. They're no longer the case. And so this movement of trying on a new name and realizing that it might not fit you is something that resonates with some trans folks. Some trans folks will try on a new name to see, like, is this me? Is this my name? And then they realize a little while later, like, actually that one doesn't really fit. And that's okay. It's okay to try to figure out what your new name is, and sometimes it's not always going to stick right away, right? But eventually you come to a place where you can understand who you are called by other people and by God. The most famous story of renaming, of course, is Simon becoming Peter, right? And Jesus renaming Peter. So this text here, Matthew 16, 15 through 18 says, Jesus says to them, "Who do you say that I am?" And Simon Peter answered, "You are the Messiah, the Son of the living God." And Jesus answered him, "Blessed are you, Simon, son of Jonah, for flesh and blood has not revealed this to you, but my Father in heaven. And I tell you, you are Peter, and on this rock I will build my church, and the gates of Hades will not prevail against it." So we see this text and we go, yeah, Peter's getting his new name, right? The new name with the new identity as the rock of the church. What we might not notice is that Jesus is getting a new name in this text too, because in this gospel account, Jesus has not been called Messiah before. This is the first time Peter says, "You're the Messiah, you are the anointed one of Israel," right? So we've got both kinds of naming happening in the same text. Peter gets a new name with a new identity, and Jesus gets a new name to recognize the identity that he already has. This is also a great example of God renaming and humans renaming, right? It seems to happen from God and humans sometimes at the same time, and we don't even notice it. Let's talk about bodies for a second. One of the things that, when we talk about bodies and we talk about the importance of bodies, Psalm 139 has been important for many people, right? We live in a culture that oftentimes saddles us with a lot of shame about our bodies, especially if our bodies look different in some way, especially if our bodies are part of a marginalized community, right? Psalm 139 is powerful in reminding us of the belovedness of our bodies. It says, "It was you who formed my inward parts. You knit me together in my mother's womb, and I praise you, for I am fearfully and wonderfully made," right? Sometimes people will look at this text and say, well, they'll use it as kind of a foreordained or predestined sort of thing, right? Saying, you were knit together in your mother's womb. Your body was made in your mother's womb in a specific way, and you shouldn't change that. That's foreordained. And they're talking about sort of the shape of your body and how we assign sex to it, right? And the interesting thing about this text is that in the world of the Hebrew writers, in the world of the Hebrew Bible, there was not the Greek assumption that people were separate into body, mind, and spirit. That's a Greek idea that came much later. Body, mind, and spirit is a Greek thing. In the Hebrew world, you are whole. You are one thing. You are shalom, right? You are a whole being. And so when you are knit together in your mother's womb, that doesn't just mean your body. That means your mind. That means your soul. That means your identity. All of that is knit together by God in a meaningful and wonderful way. And so the more that we understand about the brains and the identities of gender non-conforming people, of trans people, of intersex people, the more we realize that there is a wholeness of knitting here, right? It's hard to separate all of those three parts of gender. And we recognize that perhaps all of those things are part of the wonderfully made being that we are. And it's not just about one part of our body, mind, or spirit. The other text around bodies comes from John 20, and this one was introduced to me by my friend Asher, who I mentioned earlier, who graduated the year after I did at Seminary. He pointed to this text. This is after Jesus' resurrection. He's in the room. He comes into the room where the disciples are, and Thomas isn't with them. And then Thomas later says, I won't believe until I see the wounds on his hands and the wound on his side, right? So this next part happens when Thomas is actually there. A week later, the disciples were again in the house, and Thomas was with them. Although the doors were shut, Jesus came and stood among them and said, "Peace be with you." Then he said to Thomas, "Put your finger here and see my hands. Put out your hand and put it in my side. Do not doubt, but believe." And Thomas answered him, "My Lord and my God." And Jesus said to him, "Have you believed because you have seen me? Blessed are those who have not seen and yet have come to believe." This text pulls two things out of me and a lot of trans folks. The first one is the recognition that post-resurrection, after Jesus has risen from the dead, his body does not go back to being sort of immaculately perfect. He holds on to the parts, the things on his body, the scars on his body that tell his story. He still has that post-resurrection. That means something to me. For instance, I can't count the number of times people have asked me, like, well, what do you think your body's going to be like in heaven? What do you think your body's going to be like post-resurrection? Will it be like, the assigned sex you were born with, or will it be like you are now? And looking at this text where Jesus holds all the things in his body that tell his story means something to me as somebody who has had a surgery that gave me 2 really cool scars across my chest, right? This idea of like having those pieces of your story still with you and the way Jesus has those things. The other thing that jumps out to me about this story is the way that Thomas needs to see Jesus' body and those parts of his body that tell his story in order to believe. The way that Jesus' understanding of that, is compassionate of that, does give him what he needs in that moment, and yet says, look, I don't need to put my suffering and pain on display for literally everybody who asks, right? I need people to believe me when I tell them what happened. I need people to believe me when I tell my story, and not to require me to put that suffering on display for them every time they ask, right? That to me resonates as a trans person who sometimes can be in a place where I can be like, yeah, for sure, let me tell you about the surgery that I went through, or like how this happened to my body. Sometimes, yes, sometimes that makes sense. Other times, we need people to believe the stories of our experiences, right? Other times we need people to believe when they haven't seen. The last group of people I want to introduce to you are the eunuchs throughout Scripture. Eunuchs are people, usually in Scripture, eunuchs are people who were assigned male at birth and then were castrated, right? That's usually the way that we think about eunuchs in sort of the dictionary definition part of the term. Castration was really common in the ancient world for a lot of different reasons, some of which we don't understand at all today, like don't make sense to us one bit, right? Sometimes castration was something that was done when people were taken into slavery and it was against their will. That was definitely a major way that this happened. Other times, people would choose castration for religious reasons, to be part of a religious community. They would choose it to be economically viable in a way that they couldn't be before. Sometimes it was the choice between, do you want to be a slave that makes bricks all day, or do you want to be the king's advisor who works in the palace and knows where their next meal is coming from? And for some people, that made sense, right? There were lots of different reasons that eunuchs existed in the ancient world. What we know about eunuchs is that they existed outside of a binary gender system. They weren't seen as quite male, they weren't seen as quite female, they were a third thing, they were a different thing. And because they were a third and different thing, there was a space for them in their society, but they also weren't totally understood or trusted. So they were still kind of a marginalized category, right? So that's what you need to know about eunuchs. The Talmud that existed and was sort of coming together and being codified in the couple hundred years after Jesus lived was the collection of Jewish oral law. The Jewish oral law recognized several different kinds of ways that people could have a gender or a sex that is different from what we might see normally. The Talmud recognized a couple different people. They recognized people who had differences from the time they were born, right, who were born with differences in sex characteristics, people that we would today call intersex, right? They also recognized people whose presentation of gender changed throughout their life. So even though they have completely different words and understandings about how this happened and why this happened, the fact that they recognize people outside of a gender binary is kind of a big thing for us to remember when we're looking at texts from this time period, from the ancient world. So having said that, let's look at a couple of these texts. The first one is the third text that is usually used against trans folks, and this is Deuteronomy 23:1. It's specifically a verse that says, "You shall not create eunuchs. You shall not castrate anybody." Again, we think this was probably written because castration was part of other religious practices in cultures nearby, right? We think that was probably why. But the problem with this text is this is written back in Deuteronomy, right? If you remember the sort of structure of the whole story of Israel, after they receive the law, several hundred years later, when they're a kingdom, they get attacked by Babylon and then by Persia, and they're taken into captivity, first to Babylon and then in Persia, right, where castration is super common. When they finally come back from slavery in Babylon and Persia, and they come back to Israel, and they're going to start to rebuild, and they're going to create a new temple, they go back to their old laws, and they go, how do we make a just society? How do we do what is right in the eyes of God? And they look back at all these rules, and they come to Deuteronomy 20:31, and they go, oh no, because at this point, pretty much everybody has a family member who is a eunuch. At this point, an extended family member is probably somebody who has been castrated because of how common it was. So this is kind of a direct correlation to a lot of people who are now in Christian churches but have LGBT family members who are kind of like, what do we do with the fact that we are trying our best to be in community and yet we have family members who are not supposed to be part of that community? What do we do with that, right? So that's where the people of Israel are kind of stuck until the prophet Isaiah starts speaking. God speaks through the prophet Isaiah in Isaiah chapter 56. And God says, do not let the foreigner join to the Lord say, the Lord will surely separate me from his people. And do not let the eunuch say, I am just a dry tree. For thus says the Lord, to the eunuchs who keep my Sabbaths, who choose the things that please me and hold fast to my covenant, I will give in my house and within my walls a monument and a name better than sons and daughters. I will give them an everlasting name that shall not be cut off. So this moment where, yeah, right? This is my favorite text, so I'm excited. This moment where it looks like God has changed God's mind about inclusion in response to what's happening with the community. That's a huge moment, right? This idea that God says, I know what I said before, but things have changed. This is how the community needs to look today. You need to remember that these people who are the most marginalized, the foreigner and the eunuch, they are now welcome within my walls. For me, when I look at this text, it reminds me of my commitment, because of my connection in this passage, to anybody who is a refugee or a migrant. My liberation is bound up in their liberation because of this text, right? This is an important text in the history of Israel. So you would think, like, well, this is great. Everything changes after this, right? Eunuchs get included now, right? Unfortunately not. Because like there still are today, right, we have different ideas about how to move forward in community. The vision that we see in Isaiah is one vision. The other vision we read about in Ezra and Nehemiah, and that vision was much more restrictive in terms of who was allowed into the community of Israel, and that vision eventually won out in Second Temple Judaism. That was the vision that actually came to be. And so eunuchs and foreigners were not allowed into the central part of the temple. They were not allowed to be part of the Israelite community in a way that we see here in Isaiah. So let's flash forward to Jesus' time. Jesus mentions eunuchs once in Matthew 19, and he says, not everyone can accept this teaching, but only those to whom it is given. For there are eunuchs who have been so from birth, there are eunuchs who have been made eunuchs by others, and there are eunuchs who have made themselves eunuchs for the sake of the kingdom of heaven. Let anyone accept this who can. I love that Jesus bookends this on both sides by, this is confusing, it's okay if you don't get it. Because this is a weird text, right? Jesus is recognizing three different kinds of people who he calls eunuchs. The first one, people who are born different, to which everybody goes, yeah, intersex people. We know that. We're writing about that in this collection of Jewish law, like around the same time, right? We know intersex people exist. Second category, people who have been made eunuchs by others. These are the people that were taken into captivity, right? This is the history of enslavement in ways that have bodies have been changed against people's will. That's the second one. The third one is the one we all argue about. Who is this third category? Eunuchs who have made themselves eunuchs for the sake of the kingdom of heaven. For a while, the church was like, we need to take this literally. Like, maybe Jesus really does mean people should castrate themselves for the sake of the kingdom of heaven. There's this story that Origen of Alexandria, one of the ancient church fathers, actually did castrate himself specifically because of this verse in response to what he thought Jesus was saying. However, Christianity was smart enough to know, Christian leaders were smart enough to know that if this was a requirement for discipleship, we would have a very small church. People would not be a fan of this policy. So they decided to sort of rework it and say, this is actually about celibacy. This is actually about people who decide not to be married, right? So that's another possible way of reading this text. But what we do know is that Jesus pointed to a group of people that existed in his time, who existed outside of the bounds of sex and gender, who existed as a marginalized group, and said, these people understand something about the kingdom of heaven. He did that thing that he always does, turning things upside down and saying, those people on the bottom, they get it. There's something that you can learn from them. And the fact that he used eunuchs as a positive example is kind of a big deal. The other thing, this author David J. Hester, who works on these same topics, he notes that Jesus never heals a eunuch. There's never a time when a eunuch comes to Jesus and says, something's wrong with me, can you please fix it? It never happens. So there's some understanding that even in the sort of extra canon, extra biblical text, we don't have any record of Jesus healing a eunuch, which makes us think perhaps this is not a thing that people need to be healed of necessarily, right? So just keeping that in your mind. This last text happens in Acts, right? And this is after Pentecost, right? This is after when the Holy Spirit descends on everybody. The whole story of the first couple chapters of Acts is God coming down, the Spirit resting on people that shouldn't have been allowed in, and then the disciples going, well, I guess they got the Spirit already. I guess we got to baptize them. Like in almost kind of a reluctant way sometimes. So what's happening in Acts chapter 8 is we have this person called the Ethiopian eunuch, right? The Ethiopian eunuch, he's traveled from Ethiopia to Jerusalem to go to the temple to pray. And if you put yourself in the mind of this person, you can understand why there might be some frustration, right? We're told that he's reading the prophet Isaiah as he goes along. Not that text I just read, Isaiah 56, but a little bit beforehand. He's reading what we call the suffering servant song, which Christians have tended to think about connecting to Jesus, right? But he's reading Isaiah. He knows about the scroll of Isaiah. He's on his way all the way from Ethiopia, which the ancient writers thought was like the ends of the earth. And he goes to Jerusalem to try to worship. And he would have gotten there, and he would have been allowed into the very outermost parts of the temple, what was called the court of the Gentiles, where pretty much everybody could show up, right? But he would not have been allowed any further than that. He wouldn't have been allowed into the men's court. He wouldn't have been allowed into the court of the Jews because he, as far as we know, was not actually Jewish, right? He wouldn't have been allowed as a foreigner, as a eunuch, into the center of the temple, despite the prophecy in Isaiah. So he's coming home, and you can imagine he's pretty disappointed, a little bit confused about what's going on. He meets Philip. Philip has been told by God to go to this road to meet this person. And so we read here, he was reading the prophet Isaiah, and the Spirit said to Philip, go over to the chariot and join it. So Philip ran up and heard him reading the prophet Isaiah, and he said, do you understand what you are reading? The eunuch replied, how can I unless someone guides me? And he invited Philip to get in and sit beside him. So they're reading Isaiah. They're reading this text about the suffering servant that says, like a sheep he was led to the slaughter, like a lamb silent before its shearer, so he does not open his mouth. In his humiliation justice was denied him. Who can describe his generation? For his life is taken away from the earth. And in this moment, you think about the eunuch reading this text and going, this person, denied justice? That rings a bell. Marginalized? This rings a bell. Who is this person? Who is this person who has had an experience so similar to mine? And so the eunuch asked Philip, about whom, may I ask you, does the prophet say this? About himself or about somebody else? And Philip began to speak, and starting with this scripture, he proclaimed to him the good news about Jesus. And as they were going along the road, they came to some water, and the eunuch said, look, here is water. What is to prevent me from being baptized? And it's so important to recognize that this is not a rhetorical question. The eunuch really thinks he's going to get an answer. The eunuch really thinks Philip's going to say, well, you're a eunuch, you're an Ethiopian, you're not a Jew, everything about you, your race, your ethnicity, your gender, your socioeconomic status as a slave, everything about you should be preventing you from being baptized. But instead of saying any of that, he commanded the chariot to stop, and both of them, Philip and the eunuch, went down into the water, and Philip baptized him. When they came up out of the water, the Spirit of the Lord snatched Philip away, and the eunuch saw him no more and went on his way rejoicing. This is the start of the church. This is the beginning of the church. This is what the church is supposed to be doing. So these are the texts that, when we talk about the inclusion of gender diverse people, these are the texts that matter. Because just like the Ethiopian eunuch can look back and see something in Isaiah that rings true to him, I can look back and read the story of the eunuch and see something that rings true for me. And you can see something that rings true for you about the way that you exist in community. We can see ourselves in Scripture in a powerful way. So when we talk about what it means to be the church, one of the things that it's important to recognize is that we are different, right? We're not the same. We are supposed to be in community, and yet we are not the same. And the one verse here that I want to pull out for us is Galatians 3:28, which says, "There is no longer Jew or Greek, no longer slave or free, no longer male or female, for all of you are one in Christ Jesus," right? This text, this was actually my baptism text. This was the verse that I pulled out and was like, finally, gender, doesn't matter. This text is so important in reminding us that our human constructs can't get in the way of God's love and shouldn't get in the way of our ability to be together. But at the same time, we want to be careful not to use this text to whitewash things, right? We don't use this text to say, well, none of our differences matter because we're all one in Christ Jesus. Our differences still matter. Our identities still matter. These things still matter. They matter to us. They matter to our relationships that we have, right? My friend Lynn, who is a Native American trans person, a two-spirit person, says, this reminds us that we are not called to sameness, we are called to oneness, and those things are different. To be the same means to be a wall painted all the same color, and to be one means to be a stained glass window, right? That is what we are called to be as a church.